There is a country you have never heard of. It had forests, rivers wider than the Thames, hills you could walk for days without reaching the end of. Herds of red deer moved through its valleys. Wild horses ran across its plains. Aurochs, wild cattle the size of bison, drank from its lakes. People lived there, thousands of them, for 6,000 years. They hunted, they fished, they buried their dead with care, with flowers, with tools they would need in the next world. They had names for the rivers. They had names for the hills. They had a word in a language we will never recover for home. And then the sea came for them, not in a single day, not in a single year. The water rose for generations, slowly enough that no one alive could quite see it, fast enough that every grandchild grew up on a coastline their grandparents would not have recognized. The country shrank. The forests drowned. The hunting grounds became marshes. The marshes became sea. Until sometime around 6,000 years before the pyramids were built, the last family stood on the last hill and watched their entire world disappear under the waves. We have a name for this country now. It is not the name they used. They left no name behind. We call it Doggerland, and it is still down there. To understand what was lost, you have to forget the map. The map of Europe, you know, Britain as an island, France across the Channel, the North Sea between them. That map is a recent invention. Geologically, it is brand new. For most of the last 100,000 years, Britain was not an island. It was the western edge of a vast plain that stretched unbroken from the cliffs of what is now Yorkshire all the way to what is now Denmark. The North Sea did not exist. Where its gray waters now churn, there was land, good land. Some of the best in Europe. Rivers ran through it. The Thames flowed eastward across this plain and joined the Rhine in a single mighty river that emptied into the Atlantic somewhere far to the north. Forests of oak and elm-covered hills where today there is nothing but cold ocean. When the last ice age ended, around 12,000 years ago, the glaciers retreated and life flooded into this newly warm landscape. Mammoths still walked there in the early years. So did woolly rhinos. So did giant deer with antlers 3 meters across, and so did people. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, modern humans, indistinguishable from us in every way that matters, followed the herds north as the ice melted. They built camps along the rivers. They wove fishing nets from plant fibers. They crafted barbed harpoons from antler bone. They lived in shelters of hide and timber. They were skilled, intelligent, and patient. They knew the land the way you know your own neighborhood. This was their country. For 6,000 years, generations were born and died there without ever knowing a world that didn't include it. It was, by some measures, the richest hunting territory in all of Europe. And then the ice that had built it began to give it back to the sea. The water rose first in places nobody noticed. A coastline that had been dry in your grandfather's time was now a salt marsh. A river mouth that had once been miles inland was now tidal. A favorite hunting ground became too soft to walk on, then became reeds, then became open water. Year by year, the changes were small enough that you could explain them away, small enough to ignore. But across centuries, the changes were catastrophic. By 8,000 years ago, the Great Plain had shrunk. The northern half, the part that had once connected Scotland to Norway, was already gone. What remained was a large island in the middle of a growing sea, surrounded on all sides by a world that was eating it alive. We call this remnant Dogger Island. It was still vast, still inhabited, still home to thousands of people. From its central highlands, you could not see the sea on any horizon, but the sea was coming. We know this because we have found their tools at the bottom of the North Sea. Fishermen in the late 20th century, dragging their nets across the sea floor, began pulling up things they could not explain. Antler harpoons, flint blades, bone fragments shaped by human hands, a piece of carved wood, a human skull. For decades, these finds were treated as curiosities, strange objects from nowhere. Then in 1931, a fishing trawler called the Kalinda hauled up a chunk of peat from a depth of 30 meters off the English coast. When the captain broke the peat open to clean his net, an antler harpoon, beautifully carved and clearly the work of human hands, fell out onto the deck. The peat was 8,000 years old. It was a piece of forest floor, preserved by the sea that had swallowed it. That harpoon was the first proof, the first hard, undeniable proof that there had been a country there. A country full of people. A country with hunters who carved their tools with skill. A country whose forests and meadows and homes were now 30 meters below the surface of the ocean. And the most haunting part is this. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who lived through Doggerland's drowning. They were us. Anatomically modern humans. Cognitively modern humans. They had the same brains, the same emotions, the same capacity for love and grief and memory that you do. They watched their country die, and they had no way to stop it. There is a word in modern science for the thing that finally killed Doggerland. Storega. Around 8,200 years ago, about 6,200 BC, a section of the continental shelf off the coast of what is now Norway broke loose. 3,000 cubic kilometers of seabed slid into the deep Atlantic in a single catastrophic event. It is one of the largest underwater landslides ever identified in the geological record. When that much Earth moves that fast, it displaces an unimaginable amount of water. It generates a tsunami. The wave that the Storega slide produced was not the kind of tsunami most people have seen on the news. It was something far older and far worse. The geological evidence, preserved in layers of sand, pushed deep inland in Scotland, in the Faroe Islands, in Norway, suggests that a wave at least 20 meters high struck the coastlines of the North Sea basin. Doggerland sat directly in its path. Whatever was left of that drowning country, the last island, the last hunting camps, the last villages clinging to the high ground, would have been hit by a wall of water taller than a 6-story building, moving at the speed of a jet aircraft. It would have arrived without warning. There would have been no horizon line to read, no siren, no instinct in any human alive at that time that could have prepared them for what was coming. The wave would have killed almost everyone in its path. For a long time, archaeologists believed Storega was the moment Doggerland ended, the single, sudden, catastrophic blow that wiped the last of it from the map. But more recent research has complicated that picture. The wave certainly destroyed any coastal settlement it touched. Whole communities erased in a single afternoon. But Doggerland itself, the Central Highlands, the deeper interior, may have survived as a shrinking island for centuries afterward. Smaller, damaged, cut off from the mainland, but still there, still home to whoever was left. The final drowning came slowly in the centuries that followed. Sea levels continued to rise. The island grew smaller. The forests that had survived the wave were finally swallowed. The last of the inhabitants, those who had survived Storega, those who had rebuilt, eventually faced a choice they could not refuse: leave or drown. Sometime around 5,500 BC, 3,500 years before the first stones were laid at Stonehenge. 2,000 years before the first cities of Mesopotamia, the last people of Doggerland walked off their last beach. They left behind their dead, their tools, their buried memories, and they left behind their country. What did they think, those last refugees, as they crossed onto what is now the British coast or the Dutch coast or the Danish coast and looked back at the water? We will never know. They had no writing. They left no monuments. The language they spoke is gone. Their names are gone. Even their faces, reconstructed today from the few skulls we have recovered from the seafloor, feel like the faces of strangers we should somehow recognize. They became the ancestors of every modern population in Northern Europe. Their genes are inside hundreds of millions of people alive right now. If you have ancestry from Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, there is a measurable chance that some part of you is descended from someone who watched Doggerland die. You carry the memory of a drowned country in your DNA. You just don't have the words for it anymore. Today, the North Sea is one of the busiest stretches of water on Earth. Container ships move across it day and night. Oil platforms drill into the seabed. Fishing fleets work waters that have been worked for centuries. And every year, those fleets bring up the country that lies below. Mammoth tusks, the teeth of woolly rhinos, antler harpoons, perfectly preserved, worked flints, pieces of human bone, a femur, a piece of jaw, occasionally a skull, trees still rooted to ancient soil, lifted out of the water in the nets of fishermen who do not always understand what they are holding. Marine geologists have begun to map Doggerland using seismic surveys originally designed to find oil. The hidden landscape is emerging. River valleys, hills, lakes, ancient coastlines. A country in higher and higher resolution, drawn meter by meter from beneath the waves. The maps look like any other map. Rivers winding through valleys, coastlines curving around bays, highlands rising in the center. The only difference is that this country is 50 meters underwater, and somewhere in those drowned valleys, in soil that has not seen the sun for 8,000 years, the bones of a people who lost everything are still lying where they fell. They were not primitive. They were not stupid. They were not less than us in any meaningful way. They were people with families, with memories, with a word for home, and their country drowned. The sea has done this before. It will do it again. The only question is whether the people living through the next drowning will have the words their ancestors lost. The words to describe what is happening. The words to warn the children. The words to remember the country before it was gone. The Mesolithic families of Doggerland did not get to leave us their story. The North Sea did. It is still telling it. One bone, one tool, one drowned forest at a time. Every time a fishing net is pulled from the deep.